So good day. I ended the first video without starting chapter 1, even though the original plan was to include chapter 1, was because the first or the introduction turned out longer than I anticipated. So the second video now would start with chapter 1. But before we officially start with chapter 1, I'd like us to go through the chapters of the conceptual framework. There are 8 chapters in the framework. The first 4 chapters are the ones in the slides that are being presented right now. Chapter 1 is the objective of general purpose financial reporting, which would be the content of this video. Chapter 1 is more of telling us on how we should be processing financial reports, how we are going to use the information that will be provided. As far as examinations are concerned, I don't think there would be a lot of questions that would be asked for chapter 1, except perhaps on who the primary users are. Examinations will always ask that question. There will always be a question in which you will be asked who are the primary users. So for me, I think that would be the most common question that will come out from chapter 1. But chapter 1 is equally important because, especially if you're just starting in accounting, especially if you're just learning accounting, chapter 1 helps you develop the correct frame of mind for you to be able to understand on how to use the financial statements. And if you know how to use financial statements, then it will also help you become good preparers of the financial statements. Chapter 2 and chapter 4 are the chapters that would produce most of the questions out of the framework because chapter 2 provides us with a lot of terminologies. Chapter 2 is about qualitative characteristics of useful financial information. So we will be encountering adjectives here that will be used to describe financial information. Well, chapter 4 are your elements of financial statements, and this is again a rich source of question because this involves a lot of terminologies. So for chapters that are more on concepts, there will be very few multiple choice questions from them, while chapters that are more on terminologies would definitely result in a lot of theory questions. But if we think about it, the more difficult questions would definitely come from those questions that will test your understanding on the concepts. While very few questions may come out from chapter 1 and chapter 3, you should be worried if you did not prepare at all for chapter 1 chapter 3 because the questions there would be conceptual and therefore would require analysis or logic on your part. Whereas questions from chapter 2 and chapter 4 will only test your ability to recall definitions. Very little application in chapter 2 and chapter 4. Application of your understanding in the concepts would be more on chapter 1 and chapter 3. The next 4 chapters are the recognition and recognition, measurement, presentation and disclosure, and lastly, concepts of capital and capital maintenance. We will not be discussing the entirety of chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7 because I'm afraid that if we try to cover everything that is in those chapters, it will only make us more confused. I'd rather us go back to chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7 after we have studied some accounting standards already. But we will try to pick out important terminologies and concepts in chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. Our goal is not to have a complete understanding of chapter 5, 6, and 7 as early as at this point. We will go back to chapter 5, 6, and 7 when we already have the idea or experience of handling recognition, measurement, and presentation requirements after studying accounting standards. As for chapter 8, very little attention is given to chapter 8. Chapter 8 tells you the 2 types of capital maintenance, and they are the physical capital and your financial capital. And more often than not, the physical capital is ignored because the common method that is adopted in almost all financial statements is your financial capital. So we proceed to chapter 1. So chapter 1 again tells us of the objectives of the general purpose financial reporting. So if we read the objective given in the framework, it tells us that the objective of general purpose financial reporting is to provide financial information about the reporting entity that is useful to existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors in making decisions relating to providing resources to the entity. So if we try to simplify the objective of the general purpose financial reporting, then it is to simply provide useful information to the users of the financial statements so that they can use those information in making informed decisions. To simplify it further, then it is to simply provide useful financial information. As I mentioned earlier, the most common question that is asked out of chapter 1 is who are our primary users. So our primary users are our existing and potential investors, lenders, and creditors. In short, those that provide capital or financing to the entity. So again, I'll repeat that one. The primary users of financial information are your existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors. So of course, the information will have to be about the reporting entity. As to who or what the reporting entity is, that will be tackled in chapter 3. Then of course, we aim to provide useful information so that the financial statement users can come up with informed economic decisions. Now, if our primary users are contemplating whether they should provide resources to the entity or not, what then is their information needs? What kind of decisions will they have to make? So the decisions of our primary users would be on whether to buy, to sell, or to hold the equity or debt instruments of the entity. So if the company is not going good, and based on my assessment on the financial performance and the financial position of the entity, I don't think that they would be able to recover, then might as well sell my shareholdings as early as possible. If I am a potential investor and I have observed that this entity has high potential to grow in the future, then I might decide to invest in that entity. If I am a provider of debt or borrowings, then I would have to assess the ability of the entity to make payments. The same also for your other creditors. If I am a supplier, I would have to decide first or to make an assessment whether the entity is a good payer before I decide to engage with that entity on credit terms. No problem if I will just transact with that entity on a cash basis because there's no risk on my part. But if ever I decide to engage with that entity on a credit basis, if I extend loan to that entity, then I should make an assessment on that entity's ability to make payments in the future. And also, if you're an existing shareholder, you can use the information in the financial statements by assessing whether you should re-elect your incumbent board of directors. If based on the past performance of the entity, the corporation or the company was doing well, then that might help you decide whether you should re-elect your board of directors. If our directors were negligent or not diligent in their duties as board of directors, then that might help me decide that I should vote or nominate new set of board of directors. These are the decisions that our primary users are contemplating. But of course, the answer to the decision needs of our primary users would not be stated categorically. The financial statements would not say, yes, invest in us. No, do not invest in us. Yes, extend a loan to us. No, do not extend a loan to us. Your financial statement users will have to make their assessments, their own assessments, before they decide whether to make the investment or not, to sell their investment or not, to elect or change the board of directors, to extend a credit or not. The financial statement users will have to make their assessments based on the information that is provided in the financial statement. You cannot find the answers to the questions of the financial statement users outright. Again, the answers to the questions of the primary users are not stated categorically. Your financial statement users will have to make their own assessment. So in such assessment, what then do our primary users need? So our primary users need to have an information on the amount of dividends that the entity will pay, the principal and interest payments, or the market price increases in the shares of the entity, or simply the value of the entity as a whole. So if I am an investor, I am interested on whether this entity pays out dividends or not. If I'm the type of investor that intends to hold on to these shares for a long period of time, then I would be very interested in knowing whether the entity pays out a huge amount of dividends. If my goal is to look for shares for a long-term investment, I would definitely choose an entity that pays out huge amount of dividends. But if I'm more interested on trading shares, then definitely I would go after shares that have high potential of increases in its market price. So the way that financial statement users utilize the information provided by the financial statements may be different, but definitely the process in arriving at a decision would be similar. If I am not interested in becoming a shareholder, if I'm interested only on extending a loan, then definitely I need information on the ability of the entity to pay back the principal and the interest. So of course, you would choose the entity that has a good history of paying back its capital. If this entity has a lot of cases, has a lot of collection cases against it because it does not pay back its loan obligations, and definitely that would be discouraging for our potential lenders. So again, in deciding whether to make an investment or not, we would again be very interested on the ability of the entity to give a return on our investment. An important concept to tackle would be the difference between the return of investment and the return on investment. So if you are an investor, you are not only interested that your investment will be returned, but that your investment will be returned at a premium. That you will not only be getting back your money, but you will be getting back more than what you have invested. The excess of our original investment is what we refer to as the return on our investment, and the simple payback or the simple return of the amount that we have invested is what we refer to as our return of investment. So again, primary users are not only interested on the return of their investment, but they are also interested in earning huge amounts of return on their investment. So for entities to make an assessment on the investee corporation's ability to give a return on investments, then the primary users, the financial statement users, must make an assessment of the amount, timing, and uncertainty of the cash inflows of the entity. If inflows in the entity are very few and sporadic, then definitely that is not a promising sign. If the cash inflows are very little in amount, then definitely that will also not be promising. But again, there are a lot of factors to be considered, and that is now up to the competency of our financial statement users. As we will explain later, our financial statements will not provide all the information needed by our financial statement users. It is up to them on how they are going to process the information that is provided by the financial statements so that they can make the best decision for their investments. Another thing is that financial reports, although this is not the primary goal of financial reporting, but financial reports tend to give a picture on the effectivity of your management. If the entity is not doing good based on your financial reports, then definitely that is not a good reflection on the ability of your management. But again, using financial reports to assess the performance of your management may not be the primary purpose of financial reporting, but definitely it cannot be avoided. You can definitely use your financial reports to assess the effectivity of your management, on how well your management has protected or utilized your investment or the assets of the entity. How then do financial reports satisfy the specific information needs of our financial statement users? The specific information needs of our financial statement users are satisfied when your financial reports provide information about the economic resources of the entity and the claims against the entity. To some extent, we can actually refer economic resources simply as our assets and the claims against the entity as our liabilities. But aside from information about the resources and the claims against the entity, an important information that will be provided in our financial reports would be information about the changes on those resources and claims. Of course, we expect a company to grow, and if we say a company grows, we expect that its assets or its resources will grow. But based on our assessment, by comparing the resources of the entity year in and year out, if there are no significant increases or development in its resources, then that would mean that the economy was not growing at all. If the claims against the entity continue to grow without a corresponding increase in the resources of the entity, then that will also not be a good sign. So aside from resources and claims, studying the changes in those resources and claims would be a good way of satisfying the specific information needs of our primary users. At this point, I'd like you to remind yourself on who our primary users are, because again, if there's a single takeaway from chapter 1, it would be that you should know who our primary users are. So again, our primary users are our potential and existing investors, creditors, and lenders. So as mentioned earlier, the information from our financial reports can tell us on how efficiently and effectively the management has discharged their responsibilities in using the resources of the entity. As to the nature of our general purpose financial reports, so I'll remind you that this may be a good source for a multiple choice question. Which of the following statements is not correct? Which of the following statements is correct? So, as to the nature of our general purpose financial reports, it is important for us to remember that again, our financial reports do not and cannot provide all of the information needs of our existing and potential investors, lenders, and creditors. Aside from it being very costly, it may simply be too time consuming if we prepare our financial reports in a way that it will address all the concerns or needs of our primary users. Another reason would be it is very difficult for us to anticipate the specific information needs of our primary users for a particular period of time. On this particular day, our primary users may be interested to know of one thing, and another it would be another thing. It is simply impossible for you to cater to all the information needs of your financial statement users. So our financial reports then focuses on common information needs. And even if we only focus on the common information needs of our primary users, there is an assumption that the other users, the needs of our other users would also be satisfied. Important note, other authors would say that there are two groups of users, the primary users and the secondary users. But just a reminder that the term secondary user is not used in the framework. So the framework only uses the term primary users and other users. So who are your other users? Everyone else who is not part of our primary users. And for you to know whether a certain user is a primary user or not, then all that is required from you is to know who the primary users are. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough, our primary users are our existing and potential investors, creditors, and lenders. Another nature of our general purpose financial report is that it is not designed for the financial information needs of management. This is what I think is another source for a common question. You would be asked, is management a primary user? As what I've told you earlier, if it's not among those that we consider as primary user, then definitely it is not a primary user. It's very easy for us to conclude that perhaps management is a primary user because management would always want to know about the entity. But again, our general purpose financial reports are not prepared to cater to the needs of our management. If our management have specific information needs, they do not have to rely on general purpose reports. They can easily generate their own report that would specifically cater to their needs. So our general purpose financial reports are more on the needs of those that are outside of the entity. And this is why before, in the old standard, there is a distinction between internal and external users. Okay, but that distinction is no longer present. The distinctions now are your primary and other users. It is important to note that financial reports are not designed to satisfy the information needs of your management.